democracy and development, and to save civilians from the massacres that were awaiting them. If there is anything that came out so clearly and so decisively tonight, is that this right to protect, this right to plunder, and that the real motivation here was regime change, and that the West has literally intervened on one side of the civil war and has really had in mind very materialistic, strategic, and geopolitical objectives and all that. There is no question, too, that oil is not the only determinant, but it's a very important determinant. It's not the only determinant because Libyan oil is 1.5 million barrels per day, which is literally 1.5% of the total oil production. Really, it is not much. It is very special oil in the sense that it's the cleanest oil you could find any place. It actually is the cheapest to refine. It has the lowest sulfur content, and it's so close to the European markets. Any other oil seems to come from distant areas is very close. But the most important part of the Libyan oil is the Libyan surplus, capital surplus that this oil provided, that Libya, as Professor Forte correctly had stated, was used to support liberation forces in different places and put really quite a bit of this money in the development of African states, Arab states and others. Now there are three things I would like to add to Professor Forte's things, just by the way of connecting the Libyan case to the Syrian and others. Libya is a continuation of what happened in Iraq. This is basically a one single plan of reshaping, recreating the greater Middle East in a way that would fashion it to be a docile region that would be totally aligned and allied with Western interests. And what they've really done in Libya is they very telling story, and to some extent explains some of the issues that are coming to terms in Syria and other cases. The first thing they've done in Libya is to kick the Russians and the Chinese out. And no wonder why our Harper was really trying to somehow get dividends and returns on his investment in supporting the Libyans. I'm sure the British, the French, the Americans, and all those in NATO who had supported it had this in mind. And what they've really done is to scuttle and literally dismantle all the previous contracts that were allotted or contracted with the Russians and the Chinese, and replaced by American, French, and British interests. The issue that I would like to really to somehow generalize a little bit, the three factors that tie all these things together, is that you never can talk about the Middle East without talking about oil, but you can never talk about the Middle East without talking about Israel, without talking about religion, Islam, and about Arab nations. And this is really the connecting factors that I think need to be taken into account to explain why the situation in Syria is now unfolding in a way that might very well replicate the mistakes and the issues that came about in the intervention in Libya. There is no question in my mind that the dismantling, the constraining, and the regime change in Libya was to a great extent to weaken the Arab nationalist movement in the region. There is ample evidence to suggest that when they went to Iraq, they tried to bring about all other factors, all mobilizing, all areas that you could weave some allegiance around other than Arab nationalism. All of a sudden now, the issue of Sunni versus Shia, the issue of Kurds versus Turkoman versus Arab. All this is to literally devour and change and dismantle the Arab character of that region. And this is exactly what they have really done in Libya, and this is what they will exactly do in Syria, and this seems to be a telling story here is that they want to devour the region of any nationalist commonality that would bring some power and strength to that region, and to bring it together and cement it together around some collective shared values and objectives and interests. The other thing is that I don't think that these people did not know who they're giving the arms to. All right? Hamid Belhaj, which you talked about before, was brought by NATO into Libya to lead a militia. They seem to know exactly what they really need here is to sow seeds of destruction and conflict, that this area would never come back again as a unified whole that could work together, that could cement a society or a people. They want them to be warring groups. They know very well Libya was always three parts. All right? They know the west, the east, Tripoli versus Benghazi versus the desert, and they knew that if you unravel the Gaddafi regime, you would basically fundamentally blow up in the open all the contradictions, and that this was absolutely part of their objectives, that in this region, what we really want to do is to dismantle it. What they want in Syria is to break Syria into three parts. What they've done in Iraq, they've broken into an effective three parts. What they really want to do in other parts of the Arab world is to break them into smaller ethnic sectarian groups, that there will never be any power, any capacity, any energy that could come from this collective shared will for national liberation, for national projects. They also very well know that by dismantling this region, by breaking it into parts, you are giving greater life to the apartheid regime in Israel. That you are basically providing another greater power relative to the region, to the Israeli hegemonic regime, that would then exercise without any competition or capacity to stand in its way by any other group as they war with one another. There is a great scholar in 1977. She found, it's the sister of Edward Said, if you ever heard of the great Edward Said. Rosemary Said just actually published a book last week. She died about 4 years. Her husband, Professor Sahlan, produced the book, in which she produces this document that at one time the Israelis came in and had a very large demand for greater weaponry, about $5 billion bill they needed, and that it was so necessary now that the Arab regimes have shown that they could threaten the existence of Israel, and now they needed all these weapons to protect themselves, give them the edge that would allow them to maintain their hegemony in the region. And presumably Begin met with Kissinger, and Kissinger said to Begin, yeah, you don't need any of these weapons. Because when I finish with the Arab world, there won't be a single country that look beyond its borders. They will be all embroiled in domestic conflicts. That's exactly what will happen. That's precisely what will happen. There is going to be no country in the Arab world that is able to look beyond its borders. I just came from Egypt. 15 million people have signed so far a document that calls on Morsi to abdicate. And they're going on the 30th of June in a major demonstration outside. Who is supporting Morsi? Well, you know, just 2 days ago, Morsi recalled his ambassador from Damascus and not from Tel Aviv. And he called for American use of military and air power to have a no-fly zone over Syria. My God, why? Well, he gave it to Mr. Obama. When he meets with Mr. Putin, it will be a card in his own arsenal in trying to isolate Syria and the Russian position. I mean, what we're really having here is a situation in which all this regime, one after the other, are basically and fundamentally aligning themselves against their own people. I mean, I don't see Saudi Arabia and Qatar to be the epitome of democracy to impose or to stand and support change in Syria towards democracy. The situation in Syria is very serious. But I'm not as pessimistic as others. I think the tide has been turned. The West will not dare come into the region. And it's not because they are afraid of the Syrians. For the first time, the Russians have drawn a line in the sand. And they've drawn this line in the sand because they were kicked out of Libya. And they know that there is one single area left on their side, and it's in Syria. And they want to tell the Americans that the unipolar world has ended, and has ended in Damascus. And I am convinced that if the Americans or the West want to topple the regime in Syria and change the Syrian stance, they risk a much larger war than they have ever imagined. This is something the press doesn't tell you. This is something that there is no information about, that we are at the brink of the major confrontation, and that the Russians have made it very clear, and the Chinese are behind it. Now, Chinese are a little bit more intelligent than the rest of us, and they don't make their positions very clear, but they know. They know fairly well that all what's happening now, just as they met the G8, this whole new free trade between the United States, NAFTA, and the EU has one objective in mind. This is, the Americans are going to get very little, $100 billion, which is like 1% of their GDP. The Europeans are going to get less, and some of them think they might even lose. But why are they getting together? They're getting together basically with one fundamental objective, is to undo, to constrain, to reduce, to whittle down the great vigor and economic prowess of the Chinese. And if you think the Chinese don't know about this, then join the press in Canada. There is really a fundamental story here. And this story is, the narratives they give you are all absolutely deceptive. They base it on ethics and morality, and they are absolutely, totally devoid of any ethics or any morality. The civil war in Syria, there are no winners. Any civil war, they're all losers. 80,000 people dead. These are 80,000 brothers and sisters of each and every one of us. Let me tell you that they always give you the impression as if there are only 90,000 Syrians calling for democracy. Actually, supporters of the regime have lost more. More than 50,000 of the dead are literally on the side of the regime. There is daily massacres, daily bombings, daily suicide bombers, daily incursions, daily massacres, villages that are wiped out. Just the last one you never heard about in Deir ez-Zor, where a Shiite village was wiped out of existence overnight. And in NATO's calculation, any confrontation, it's going to have another 75,000 dead. 75,000, no chips on their shoulder. Syrian blood doesn't count. Arab blood seems not to count. There is no place where so much has been destroyed, so much has been massacred, and has not raised an eyebrow. All right? 3 people dead in Boston, and this is a terrible thing. 3 people. The whole press, the CNN, the world came to a standstill. The same night there were more than 300 dead Iraqis, more than 400 dead Syrians. In the same moment, the the 3 Americans fall in. Why is Arab blood not equivalent to American blood? Why is this humanity completely and absolutely discriminatory about the value of a human life? And that's precisely what we're really facing. That if they really want anything in Syria, it's basically and fundamentally to make sure that nobody stands up to the West. One of the reasons why Gaddafi got his fate is he dared to stand up to the West. There were scores to settle. He tried, you know, like he bought the Prime Minister, probably didn't hear about this, the whole amount of money through consultation, $50 million actually, Blair had received from the Libyan regime as he consulted with him. And our great friend, Mr. Clinton, who now wants American intervention, got the view. Among them, you know, the Chancellor of London School of Economics. But anyway, the story is very clear that Gaddafi, and I've never been, and I don't think any one of our friends were enamored with him. I mean, the guy had his problems. You know, he probably belonged to a fashion show than anything else. But it's not the story, it's not the issue. The issue is that this is a leader who had stood up to the West, had supported national liberation, has used some of his oil money for his own people. This is somebody who really believed in Pan-Arabism. This is a man who believed in Pan-Africanism. And all these projects represent counter projects to the imperialist projects of dismantling and subjugation. I guess it's already 8:30 and it's like 3:30 in the morning for me. I'll stop here.